Hello, everybody. Let's get going. I'd like to get right to the program today and let you know sort of why we're doing this, this particular topic. It's because you're kind enough to indulge me in some of my interests before I leave here in February. Yep. Yes, there's a chair here. I'd like to join the circle.
Anybody wants to?
I'm saying that we're on this topic because you have been kind enough to indulge me. Thank you, Annie Kay and Greg, on some topics that really motivate my spirit. I've noticed as a pastor for 41 years, there has been a significant decline in church affiliation. I just noticed it from pastoral ministry, boots on the ground, retail religion. That younger generations in particular seem to be absent, more and more absent. And that I'm not alone in this observation. I hear this all across the board, all the denominations throughout the country. It just seems to be a repeated phenomenon. In the early 1990s, sociologists and pollsters started to be aware of this and really take note of it and be consistently attentive to this phenomenon, gathering data, trying to look at trends, trying to look at doing personal interviews with people who were once involved in religion and then pulled away to find out what their motivations, their perspectives are, and what their spiritual lives are like as well. And this trend has continued from the early 1990s to today. No sociologist assumes that any trend will continue in the future. That's like, predicting future performance of the stock market based on the past or present. However, it seems to be, if anything, accelerating, not slowing down. We're going to look at all this today. But the reason we're on this topic is because it interests me, I'll be very honest. It interests me not only as a pastor, but as someone who has grown in the last 5 to 8 years to embrace the spirituality of all human beings, regardless of religion or even no religion. My spiritual companionship program that I was in 5 years ago had a special interest in providing spiritual companionship, which is the other thing I do, and we'll do more of next year. Providing spiritual companionship even to people who are not affiliated. Even people who have no desire to believe in God or anything like that. So I see this as a growth market. And yet, bringing it back to the WCC level or any local congregation, there are clear implications for local churches, both for their present and their future, but also ministry opportunities. We're going to talk more about that next week. Today, I want to kind of lay out the data for you. We've got a nice interview with one of the great scholars in this. Well, he's kind of an accidental scholar in this field. His name is Ryan Burge. He teaches at Eastern Illinois University in Charleston, near my hometown. Near our hometown. Bob and I are from the same humble origin. This is Ryan Burge's book, and we're going to see an interview with him. In my course on spiritual companionship 5 years ago, we read this book by Elizabeth Drescher, who not only lays out the data about the nuns, but also says, how do we spiritually companion people who are not religious, which was my interest. So this is her book. We're going to do more on that next week. And then from a more specifically Christian perspective is the work of James Emery White, who again details who the nuns are in this book called The Rise of Nuns, and talks in terms of a Christian, like how do we reach out to the nuns? I'd like to begin with this clip from 10 years ago from a CBS Sunday morning program. I don't know what it's called. I'm always busy on Sunday morning. What I think happened is they were doing a program on the nuns. They had kind of done their research and their interviews, and then Sandy Hook happened. Sandy Hook is now 10 years old already in December. The terrible tragedy, the atrocity that happened in Newtown, Connecticut. And so I think what CBS News did is they took their section on the nuns, and they framed it with Sandy Hook at the beginning and the end to kind of make it more timely. So that's the reference to Sandy Hook. I think it's kind of an accidental blending of these two. But in the middle is some very good information on the nuns.
It's not just in Newtown, Connecticut, but in churches and synagogues and any other building of faith. The question why is being asked over and over this morning. In times of both heartache and happiness, we turn to our faith for guidance and comfort. But increasingly, how we think about our faith is changing. According to a new study by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, the nation's spiritual landscape may be becoming a little less religious. Some 45 million people, that's 1/5 of the U.S. adult population, now say they belong to no church in particular. 6% of them are either atheist or agnostic.
There's a yearning to find like-minded people, to be able to have a conversation that's not taboo.
How did you end up finding the group? We met Red McCall last month. He's the president of an atheist group in the Buckle of the Bible Belt, Oklahoma City.
We're not anti-religious, but we're pro-secular.
In just the past 3 years, membership has jumped from just 300 members to well over 1,000.
I do think it's getting better.
Shelley Reese, a college professor, is one of them. She says the public mood on atheists is changing, even here.
There were still people when we were marching in the parade at Halloween yelling out, "You're going to hell," and stuff like that. But there were more people who weren't. And I think that's going to keep going. I think that's the trend.
Researchers call them the nuns, those who check the nun box when asked to describe their religious affiliation. And they've doubled since 1990. We're not necessarily becoming more secular, are we?
I mean, maybe a little bit.
Carrie Funk is the senior researcher on that Pew study and says it's a complicated question because being unaffiliated isn't necessarily the same as not having faith.
68% of the unaffiliated say they believe in God or a universal spirit. More than a third describe themselves as spiritual people, but not religious people.
And a good portion of them still say they pray.
And a good portion pray, at least daily.
So if it's not God or the thought of a higher power that's turning people off, just what is? The study suggests that it's organized religion, with respondents overwhelmingly saying many organizations are just too focused on money, power, and politics. Protestants have suffered the greatest decline. They now account for just 48% of religious adults, making it the first time in history that the United States doesn't have a Protestant majority.
Every time I walk in here, I'm like, I cannot believe this place is this large.
How many people does it see?
Over 4,000 people.
Evangelical churches aren't immune either.
All right, is everybody ready for
The mega churches, once bursting at the seams, are a little less mega than they used to be.
We're seeing church attendance being much more inconsistent than I've ever seen it in my entire life.
Well, today, Lisa, we embark on a
Ed Young is the senior pastor of the Fellowship Church, based in Dallas.
The Bible talks a lot about the enjoyment of sex.
He's hardly conventional, even preaching a sermon with his wife while sitting on a double bed.
It's God. Whenever he does that, he's saying, Amen.
It's his attempt not at a gimmick, he says, but to reach those who these days find organized religion at its best irrelevant, and its worst intolerant.
I don't think we have been vulnerable enough. I don't think we have been real enough about issues and about life. You have to realize that the church is pretty much one generation away from extinction.
Indeed, it's the young, 1 out of every 3 persons surveyed, in fact, under the age of 30, who say they don't link themselves with any organized religion. Compare that with the greatest generation, where only 1 in 20 claimed no religious home.
We're in kind of a post-denominational phase, I think, in many ways in the United States. So religion is very diverse, clear differences between Zen Buddhists and Mormons.
Charles Kimball is the Director of Religious Studies at the University of Oklahoma. While he says most of his students still respect religious organizations as a power to do good in the world, it's often their stands on social issues, especially abortion and gay rights, that he feels are driving the young away.
The vast majority of students, even people coming out of pretty traditional religious backgrounds, don't see these as a big deal. They don't get what's the issue here. Don't understand it.
In my experience, a lot of my friends have become nuns because
We gathered a few of his students together. All said they believe in God, but agreed that organized religion has largely failed to adapt to a changing culture. Carly Houtling grew up a conservative Christian.
I don't understand, how a loving God can send people to hell. I'm pretty sure if I disobeyed my parents, they would not throw me in the fireplace.
I go to a church here in Norman.
J.C. Fisher was raised Methodist, and he still goes to church, but only about once a month.
Because there's so much bureaucracy and rules and things that a church has to do that don't necessarily fit with the beliefs or the tenets that they preach.
So I've sort of taken
Martha Fulton grew up Baptist, went to Catholic schools, and for the moment attends a Methodist church.
And so, while I wouldn't say that I'm really strongly affiliated with a church I go to now, I do feel that I get something out of it. And it's sort of like when a person says that they're single and looking rather than just single and not ever hoping to find anything else.
There are plenty of alternatives for those looking to worship in a more individual way. One of the most popular holiday services in New York City this time of year is a revival of the ancient solstice rituals at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Paul Winner leads that celebration.
The journey through the longest night is really intended to be symbolic of the catharsis of coming through the dark night of the soul.
And for those in Newtown, Connecticut, no night has ever been darker.
Dark times, like so many of our friends in Connecticut are having now. It's very hard to understand how we're going to reconcile that, how we'll come out the other side of it. But somewhere down deep, we hope that we have the optimism that we will overcome.
What is hope and optimism to some is faith and answered prayers to others. On this weekend in particular, as the conversation inevitably turns to the unimaginable, our thoughts of peace and human kindness bind us all as one.
Note that that's 10 years old. The stats are much different now. About 1% of those affiliated, which are usually called the Sums and the Nuns, about 1% of Sums every year become nuns. So in 10 years, these figures have doubled again. So every decade they're doubling. And note too that the evangelical megachurch pastor in 2012 said how irregular church attendance is. Imagine today, with COVID and everything else and the increasing number of nuns, it would be even more so. There's a perception among mainline Protestants like us, I'll use that phrase broadly to categorize churches like ours. There's a perception that evangelical churches are growing, and we are shrinking. What the pastor's comment here says, and what Pew's data says, again and again, is that nuns are taking from Christians of all kinds except Catholics. In other words, all Protestants are experiencing defection from being affiliated to being non-affiliated. And that's liberal Protestants, moderate Protestants, conservative, evangelical, Pentecostal. So this isn't a place where the evangelicals are kind of taking over. It's the nuns who are taking over. I'm going to use a lot of data today from the Pew Research Center. They are the go-to place for all of this stuff, as well as the, what's it called? Survey. I've got it in a slide here later. It's an organization called the National Opinion Research Council, based out of the University of Chicago, funded by the National Science Foundation. Pew's data and this other organization, the General Survey, something, their data tracks almost exactly. And there's another bar graph here that will show you that. So the data seem not to be in dispute. They seem to be replicated by every organization, including Gallup and Barnum. Here's the basic data. As best as can be remembered, only 5% of the US population was not affiliated with anything in 1972. Wow. Today, it's 29%. 29% is obviously practically 3 in 10 people. And you can see the gradual growth, more or less 1% per year in the last 10, 15, 20 years.
But there's a direct correlation between those figures and the expansion of email and the cell phone.
Right.
There's
So
tremendous correlation.
Right. So next week, we're going to talk a little bit about underlying social reasons for the shift. Technology is an interesting one. We'll get there next week. Here's some quotes from Pew's analysis of this a year ago. They did a major survey last year about this time. And December, they started actually writing some analysis of it. Self-identified Christians make up 63% of the US population, that's a year ago, down from 75% a decade ago. A decade ago. They go on to say, and I'm reading it in case you can't see the screen, the secularizing shifts evident in American society so far in the 21st century show no signs of slowing. The latest Pew survey of the religious composition of the US finds that the religiously unaffiliated share of the public is 6% points higher than it was 5 years ago and 10 points higher than a decade ago. And this is Jeffrey's bracketed comment here, about 1% per year. In addition, the share of US adults who say they pray daily has been trending downward, as has the share who say religion is, quote, very important in their lives. I've got all of the breakdown in these few reports here, old-fashioned paper style here. Another way to look at this is comparing the general ratio of Christians to nuns. 2007, that ratio was 5-1. 2021, it would be 2-1. Pew calls this switching. They use the broader term switching because people can switch from nun to Christian, or Christian to nun, or Christian to Buddhist, or Buddhist to Hindu, or, I mean, there's all kinds of switching going on. But this is what they note in terms of the Christian to nun switching. Again, this is comment just a few weeks ago, based on Pew's research from the end of last year. Religious switching tends to occur when people are younger, typically starting in their late teens. We estimate that between the ages of 15 and 29, 30% of Americans who were raised Christian become religiously unaffiliated. The bottom line is that religious switching beginning in late teen years has resulted in a net flow of millions of Americans from Christianity to unaffiliated. And remember, this isn't all the nuns, because some nuns were raised nuns. Some nuns were raised nuns. They were raised in households that did not affiliate. Pew then goes on to say, although it's from a report 2 weeks before this one, but to me it made more sense to put it this way. However, since the rise of the nuns began in the 1990s, a pattern has emerged in which a measurable share, not large, but measurable, of adults between 30 and 65 also disaffiliate from Christianity. 7% of Americans who were raised Christians will switch out between the ages of 30 and 65. Not a huge percentage, but 7% is 7%. So if you add the nuns who were raised as nuns, the nuns who are switching in their late teens and in their 20s, and adults beyond the age of 30 who are switching, you begin to see how 3 in 10 Americans are now nuns. Yes, Lori?
That's what I was gonna ask, is this the United States or the entire world?
This is just US.
Do they start off as infants as a nun, or as it when doing their confirmation? Are they inducting nuns and newborn?
So nun means not affiliated with religion.
Okay.
There are confirmands, I've noticed in pastoral ministry, who join at confirmation, but are not probably mature enough, I'll be honest here, to really have made that decision for themselves at that age and join because their friends are doing it, their parents expect them, their grandparents will disinherit them if they don't. Not really. So, total gross numbers here, 96.2 million people then would be nuns. Huge number of people. I did my own math here. Tell me if I'm right or wrong. I hope I'm right here. That's 29% of 331.9 million. And if 1% are switching over to nuns every year, that's 3.3 million every year. And of course, it's a lot of young people. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And in preparation for the next couple of slides, I put the generations as sociologists generally agree. Have you heard of these generations before?
Why Alpha?
I know, me too.
But they after Z.
I think it's like naming hurricanes. Like after they get like Hurricane Zelda, the next one, like, what's the next? So children born today are Generation Alpha. Why? Because the mighty super sociologists tell us so. And Generation Z, they say, is cutely called Generation Zoomer. Yes.
What happens to people who were born in 45?
Oh.
Yeah, what about that? They're sort of pre-war, they're sort of post-war. Take your pick. January through June, August. We're going to come back to this. For now, note millennials' birth date, 1977. So that's anybody today who's 45 and under, right? Okay. There's also Generation Z, a second generation there after the millennials. So now I'm using data from Ryan Burge, who, by the way, gets his data from Pew and the GSS, General Social, that's it, General Social Survey, the University of Chicago. So Brian Burge says 44% of millennials are nuns and 45% of Gen Zs are nuns. This tracks with everything I've always heard about the generational differences of nuns versus sons. So again, using my calculator, if there are 72.1 million millennials, as the internet tells me here are, then 44% of that number is 31.7 million. That's people born 1977 to 1995. And then Gen Z is 65 million Americans born 1996 to 2016. Yeah. Thank you. That's another 29.2, making a total number of nuns basically 61 million, age 41, 45 and under. That's a lot of people. And some of you have children and grandchildren in these cohorts. Am I right?
Yeah.
Think about your own children, your own grandchildren, your own siblings. You don't have to look very far for a nun. That's true. Let me make sure I'm on the Look hard for the song. Yeah, you have to look hard for the song. Yeah. Some people may think that Christianity is losing people to Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, so on. Pew says that is not the case. According to Pew, this is at the GSS General Social Survey conducted at the University of Chicago. Non-Christian religions have not grown significantly since 1972. You can look at the bottom line there. Do you see the bottom line? I don't know if you can quite read it. That's all other religions, not non-Christians. So in 1972, about 5%. 2021, what's it say, 7, 6?
6 and then 7.
Right. However, the number of Christians, you can see the steady decline. The number of nuns, you can see the steady increase. The implication of this graph is very simple, that the number of nuns are coming from Christians. James Emery White, the other book we're using, and this, by the way, agrees with Ryan Burge also. He's done a profile of a typical nun. This is not all nuns, it's sort of like a typical, meaning in each of these categories, nuns tend to be a majority in these classifications. He's a he, he's liberal or moderate, he's a Democrat, he's not necessarily an atheist. Talk more about that in a moment. He's not necessarily hostile toward religious institutions. Remember the atheist at the table in the CBS News part? He said, we're not anti-religion, we're pro-secular. He's not hostile toward religious institutions, he just doesn't want to belong to one. He thinks abortion and same-gender, same-sex marriage should be legal. He's white, he's young, he's not very religious. Well, that's the point. And he's more likely to be a Westerner. Westerner here means in the Western United States. And you could also add New England. Okay.
That would be along the Pacific coast.
So
The
from
Pacific coast.
think about it from the mountain west to the coast.
Yeah, this also includes the mountain regions and even the Southwest. Ryan P. Burge also, he agrees with all this. He also adds the issue of education. His conclusion is, in this book over here, is that there is no significant correlation regarding education between the nuns and the sons.
Oh, that's interesting.
There is within the nuns, but not when you compare all the nuns with all the sons. Did I? Oh, thank you. Yeah. So, is there a particular kind of Christian who's becoming a nun? The answer is yes. Protestants. Catholics hold their own pretty much. Now, that doesn't mean, so Ryan Burge talks about the 3 B's: beliefs, behaviors, and belonging. You can belong without behaving. Now, behaving here doesn't mean being a good person. It means praying daily and attending worship services. There's something about growing up Catholic, probably is my guess here, that kind of gives you kind of brand name loyalty through life, even if you aren't necessarily believing in all that stuff anymore, or even going to mass. But a sense of being Catholic seems to, this is my guess, is why the numbers of Catholics on a survey like this remain kind of constant. Protestants, though, clear nosedive here. From 52%.
They looked at effective migration on the Catholic.
Yes, they have factored all that in. And there's a distinction in the number of Catholics between white Catholics and non-white Catholics, who are almost all Latinx. White Catholic affiliation, which includes, again, belief, belonging, and behavior. White Catholic affiliation has gone down. Latinx affiliation has gone up because of immigration. Thank you, Rose. Thank you. Very good point. Again, is this just mainline Protestants or white mainline Protestants? Pew says it is not. Even though among American Protestants, 60% identify as evangelical, 40% do not. The decline seems to be across the board for both evangelical and non-evangelical white Protestants. You can read there what those percentages are. Interestingly, again, I've got my own thoughts about this. Vince or other African-American Christians may have their own thoughts about this, but for some reason, Black Protestants, their numbers tend to be stable, like Roman Catholics. My guess is there's a cultural identification there that runs very deep. And even if belief, behavior, belonging, or even if belief and behavior and belonging have shifted, the sense of affiliation is probably still there, and people still answer, yes, I am that, when a pollster asks. Vincent, I called your name out. Do you have any sense, any feelings, thoughts about that? No.
Not dragging them in.
Here is the interview. How are we doing on time? Pretty good. Here's the interview with Ryan Burge. By the way, he's an ABC pastor. That's American Baptist Churches. You will hear him say he's a Baptist pastor, and you may have all kinds of thoughts about that. The American Baptists are the former Northern Baptists that split with the Southern Baptists over the issue of slavery. The two churches never joined together again, like Methodists did. They tend to be far more liberal than Southern Baptists. He pastors a small church in Mount Vernon, there in central Southern Illinois. His interest is more as a political scientist, social scientist, sociologist in these matters. His goal here is not to win them back, get them back in the church. I say that because you might hear Baptist and think that that's what he's doing.
But there's no polemical, kind of going, he's just doing like Pew Research.
That's my point. As far as I can tell, reading his book.
This is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion.
I'm also going to mention who is Mark Tooley and what's the Institute on Religion and Democracy. This is a conservative organization. This is the group that has called out Presbyterians, UCC, Lutherans, and so forth, the usual suspects, for being too liberal and not faithful to the gospel. But his questions are just general questions of curiosity. So it's still a good interview, but that's, if you say, isn't that right-wing group? It actually is.
And Democracy here in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure today of talking with Ryan Burge. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly.
You got it, yep.
Ryan, author of a new book that is very relevant to today's conversations about religion in America. The book is called The Nones, Where They Came From, Who They Are, and Where Are They Going, obviously referring to the growing demographic in America of those who profess to have no formal religious affiliation. They are much discussed, the nones, maybe misunderstood in terms of who they are and what they don't believe, but they are a growing element in American society. So Ryan is going to explain what they're all about. So Ryan, what persuaded you to write this book?
Well, it was a tweet really that kind of got the book all started. I was a guy who had like 500 Twitter followers, and one day I sent out this tweet from the General Social Survey data that said that the nones are as large as evangelicals or Catholics, and they're continuing to grow very rapidly. And that tweet, for reasons I don't fully understand, even to this day, went viral, and it got retweeted over 1,000 times. And all of a sudden, people from the CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Times of London, I mean, people all over the world were calling me wanting to talk about the nones. And so I thought, if I'm going to write a book, I might as well write a book about something that people already care about and kind of what I'm known for. And there was just, there's just this latent desire to understand how American society is changing. Everyone kind of knows that we're becoming less religious, but no one's ever been really sort of able to quantify and kind of explain it in a meaningful way. So, the book was my attempt to kind of translate all the data that I know to a lay audience who is interested and engaged, but maybe doesn't really want to dig into, a big academic text. So I wanted to kind of go to that middle audience, that trade level, kind of academic level audience. And that's where the nones came from.
And where do you teach and what is your background?
So I'm a assistant professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University in Charleston, Illinois. I have a PhD in political science from SIU Carbondale. Got that in 2011. I'm also a pastor. I've been a pastor in the American Baptist churches for almost 20 years now. I serve my current church, First Baptist Church of Mount Vernon, Illinois. I've been the pastor there for over 15 years now, the longest serving pastor in the history of the church. So I study religion and politics, generally speaking. So I kind of take both sides of my life and kind of mix and match it together. I remember when I was 17 years old, one of my teachers in high school was like, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to be a lawyer and a youth pastor. And she laughed, saying like, that's kind of an impossible thing. And I saw her a couple of years ago and I was like, well, I mean, I kind of got it right. I'm in the same kind of ballpark on both aspects. So I'm bivocational in the pastorate because it's a very small church of about 15 or 20 people. And then I teach full time.
And the nuns, who exactly are they? People assume they're overwhelmingly secular, but many of them are self-identified as spiritual. Some of them attend places of worship regularly.
Yeah. So the nuns are about 30% of America. Different polls put them a different number, anywhere between 27 and 34%. But I think 30% is kind of the right number. So if you put 5 nuns in a room, one's an atheist, one's an agnostic, and 3 are a group called Nothing in Particular. And that's really the group I wanted to kind of zero in on in the book and talk about a lot more, is the fact that 60% of the nuns are nothing in particular. And they are completely different than atheists or agnostics on all kinds of other measures. For instance, only 21% of Nothing in Particulars have a 4-year college degree. It's 47% of atheists and 44% of agnostics. So, in terms of education, they're not even on the same planet. Nuns are at the very bottom and atheists, agnostics are near the top. Economically, 60% of Nothing in Particulars make $50,000 as a household per year or less, which means that most of these nuns live in poverty. Amongst atheists, only 40% make $50,000 or less, and 25% of atheists make more than $100,000 a year. So completely different worlds. Atheist agnostics do not go to church. Very, very, very rarely. 95% of them never go to church or seldom go to church. Amongst Nothing in Particular, it's about 30% of them say they go at least once a year, if not more. So, there's a new book that came out called Secular Surge by Dave Campbell and Lehman and John Green out of Notre Dame. And they make this really interesting kind of comparison. They say that atheist agnostics are secular. They have a secular worldview, which means they're basically anti-religion. They don't like religion. They don't want any more religion in America. They want to fight against religion as much as possible. But then there's the non-religious. And the Nothing in Particulars are non-religious because it's not like they're anti-religion, but they're not pro-religion either. When they hear the religion question, I think for most of them, they kind of shrug their shoulders and go, I'm not for that, but I'm not for that either. So they're not anti-religion. They're not turned off by faith. They just don't feel some sort of deep abiding connection to it and just don't want to affiliate with religion on surveys.
The stereotype about nuns is often that they're urban, educated millennials, but it's much more complicated, you're saying.
Oh, you can't get to 30% of the population by being one thing, right? You got to be everything now. So now it's old and young. It's black, it's white, it's Asian, it's Hispanic, it's every generation, it's every economic strata. And even increasingly now, we're seeing more nuns are Republicans or conservatives, political conservatives, because they've kind of hit the ceiling when it comes to drawing in liberals. Now, that's not to say that liberals are not more likely to be nuns. That's absolutely true. But we're seeing more and more, the nuns are becoming a politically diverse coalition, which actually kind of creates all these interesting problems for the future of American politics and religion about how the parties kind of, navigate this changing world, because the world looks completely different today than it did even 30 or 40 years ago when it comes to religion.
To what extent does the rise of the nuns reflect increased secularization, and to what extent does it reflect the collapse of the Protestant denominations and the decline of institutional Christianity?
I think it's both and. So one thing that I think most people don't realize is that the rise of non-denominational Protestant Christianity in this country is just unprecedented. In 1972, about 3% of all Protestants were non-denominational, and now it's 25%. Of all Protestants are non-denominational. If you look back over the last 10 years, the only Protestant tradition that grew in size was non-denominational. Baptists are down, Methodists are down, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, all down over the last 10 years. The only one that has grown in size is non-denominationals. And one of the reasons that evangelicalism is still so robust in this country is because non-denominationals kind of picked up the slack that have been left behind by like the Southern Baptists, for instance, who lost 2.1 million members in the last 15 years. So I think that's part of it, is this non-denominational shift we're seeing in American Protestant Christianity. The other side is, you know, there's this whole theory that America was destined to be less religious because it became more economically prosperous and had higher levels of education. There's this old theory in sociology called secularization theory, which says that the more education you have, the less God you need. And, you know, the evidence of that is Western Europe. I mean, countries like Germany, only 8% of Germans go to church once a week. You know, and even in Italy, it's only 20%. So, you know, we were going to look more and more like Western Europe. The interesting question is, why did it take so long and why has it gone so slowly? I mean, we should be, if we were on the trend line, 0% of Americans should say religion's very important. But instead, it's over 50% of Americans say religion's very important. So we're still much more religious than we should be comparing ourselves to Western Europe.
Is it fair to say that many of these nuns are at least sporadically attending non-denominational churches, but don't really identify as anything specifically Christian?
I think I think a lot of them are kind of, there's this category that kind of bops around academic literature called SBNR, spiritual but not religious. And you see that in data. Like, for instance, 37% of people say they're very spiritual, but only 21% of people say they're very religious. Because, you know, religion has this negative connotation in American life. And I don't think it's just religion, by the way. I think it's all institutions have a negative connotation. We reject labels. We don't want to be branded by anyone that we're anything this, that, or the other. So we're seeing more and more people say they're politically independent or politically moderate when they're really not. People say they're not religious when they actually do go to church. So like I mentioned before, 30% of nothing particulars go to church at least once a year. And if you look, and I think this is really kind of for the church to think about. So there's this panel data where they asked people in 2010 and 2014 what their religion was. Same people, so you could track change at the individual level. Okay, amongst atheists, 99% of them were still nuns 4 years later. Okay, amongst agnostics, it was 96% were still nuns 4 years later. So very little switching there. But amongst nothing in particulars, 4 years later, 16% of them were Christians and 8% of them moved to another faith tradition, whether it be Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Islam. So you're talking a quarter of nothing in particulars switch from being a nun to being a sum 4 years later. So they're not really that anti-religion. I think there's this term we use called liminal. They kind of move in and out of these spaces where it's they're very, very religious and they're secular for a while, then they kind of bounce back and forth, back and forth. That's what the nothing in particulars are. We almost always see when someone leaves religion, they don't go from being like an evangelical to an atheist. They kind of stop at that nothing in particular pathway on the way there and on the way back, by the way. There's very little data that says that atheists become, you know, evangelicals or Catholics. Almost always that nothing in particular is sort of like a way station, like a transfer station between religion on one side and secularism on the other side. And most people pass through that pathway. And I think that's really where the battle over American religion is being fought, is in that nothing in particular group.
And the numbers of self-professed atheists and agnostics have risen, but still relatively small. So is it accurate to say that America is becoming more secular, or is it more accurate to say America is less institutionally religious?
Yeah, I would say we're less religious and slightly more secular. Right. So in 2008, about 6 or 7% of Americans said they were atheists or agnostics. Now it's 12%. Which is, I mean, a rise, but you still got to think 88% of Americans do not identify as atheist or agnostic. And even I posted this stat on my Twitter the other day, even amongst never attending people. So people who never attend church, you ask them how they believe about God. People are just as likely amongst that group. People are just as likely to say that God exists without any doubt as they are to say God does not exist. So even amongst like never attending people, there's still a lot of belief in this country. And I think that's something that is easily looked over when we think about religion. So when we think about religion, we think about it in three dimensions. There's behavior, which is like going to church. About 45% of Americans never go to church. Okay. Then there's belonging, which is like, I say I'm not religious. I say I'm atheist. I say I'm agnostic. I say I'm nothing in particular. That share of Americans is about 30%. And then the last share is, what do you believe about God? Only about 10% of Americans say they don't believe in God, or they have an agnostic view of God where he might exist, but they just can't tell for sure. So 40%, 30%, but only 10% of Americans say they don't believe at God at all. So there's only about 5 or 6% of Americans who don't believe, don't belong, and don't behave. So really the nuns of America is about 1 in 20 of us. We are still a deeply religious place, although I do think secularism is on the march because especially on social media, and you probably have seen this as well, atheist agnostics are very loud. They are very proud of their position. They actually like the opposition. There's actually data I just saw the other day that said that even when they're confronted with discrimination and anger for their beliefs, atheists actually dig in more because of that. So they're very, very reticent in what they believe. So things like empty the pews is a very like atheist agnostic secular idea. So they're a group that are small in number, but I think they're actually overrepresented on social media, and they're actually overrepresented in politics too, because atheists are the most politically active religious group in America today. Even if you control for education, which some people say, oh, it's because they're more educated, they're more active. Even if you control for education, they're still more active than evangelical Protestants are. In 2020, over 50% of atheists donated to a candidate or campaign. Over 50%. It was only 22% of white evangelicals. So they're they punch above their weight, atheists and agnostics do. So I think it's kind of like a thing where like their actual numbers aren't that large, but the perception of what they do is much larger because of how engaged and active they are in the political process and in the social media dialogue.
So atheists and agnostics obviously in their politics lean much farther to the left than the general population.
Yeah.
In terms of the religious nuns, they also are farther to the left than obviously religious Americans are, but to what extent?
So atheist agnostics, agnostics are actually kind of a light version of atheists. So if like 80% of agnostics voted for Biden, it'd be 75%, I'm sorry, if 80% of atheists voted for Biden, it'd be 75% of agnostics. So just slightly towards the center from atheists. Atheists are the most liberal religious group in America today. Even Black Protestants don't call themselves liberal. More Black Protestants call themselves moderate than liberal. Atheists are loud and proud about how liberal they are. I actually looked at this data that asked people to put themselves on a scale from 1 to 7, 1 being very liberal and 7 being very conservative. Atheists over the last 4 years actually see themselves trending to the left, like towards the very liberal side. And they actually see the Democratic Party moving towards the middle. They're the only religious group that said that. Most people saw the Democratic Party staying where it was or even moving a little bit to the left. Atheists are like, whoa, the Democrats are way too moderate for us now, and we've gone out to the edge. So they're actually like very liberal and very proud of it. Now, amongst your nothing in particulars, they are center-left people, okay? So they generally lean towards the Democrat, 60-40. In like a generic election. It varies though. So for instance, in 2016, they were only 55-45, 55 for Clinton, 45 for Trump. And I think one reason is because they liked Trump because he was a guy like them, who was the outsider. Like I represent, no one's representing you and I'm representing you and I'm going to shake Washington up because it's not working for you. And a lot of these nothing in particulars are anti-institution, right? They think society's not working for them. They like outsiders. But what's interesting is, so they voted, 55-45 in 2016, but then in 2020 comes around and it goes right back to the way it was before. The old guard of 62-38 or 60-40, because I think they saw Trump, they thought he was going to be this rebel, right? This guy who was an outsider, drained the swamp, all that stuff. And then after 4 years in office, they realized he was just like everyone else, just like a politician like everyone else. And so they went back to that normal configuration, which is they favored the Democrats about 60-40. And I think they're actually one of the most interesting, most consequential religious groups in America today, nothing in particular, because you got to think about 21% of Americans are nothing in particular. It's the same size as evangelicals. No one's talking about the nothing in particular vote, and everyone talks about the white evangelical vote. But if you can swing 5% of the nothing in particular as your direction, that can mean the difference in a swing state.
Here's a little summary. The time we have left. This is what I got from Brian Burgess' interview. The first bullet point here to me is the most salient.
Louder.
I'm sorry?
A little louder, please.
My voice? Really? I have never been accused of having a soft voice. What I got out of the Ryan Burge interview, these bullet points, the most salient, I think, is the first bullet point on the left. Not all nuns are alike. So remember, he said, in a room where there are 5 nuns, any given 5 nuns, one is an atheist, one is an agnostic, 3 is this very important group he calls nothing in particulars. That's his area of interest and focus because they are more diverse in their beliefs and their belonging and in their behavior and in their politics and in their education and in their income level. Atheists and agnostics, he said, are pretty well fixed in all of those things. So I found that to be helpful. Looking at the nuns as a whole, they are all of that. You can't get to 30% of the American population by being just one thing, he said. Hold on, I need just have a couple minutes to finish up. The rise of non-denominational Christianity, he says, has been significant. These next two bullet points are similar. That is, America still seems to be deeply religious. Even half of the nothing in particulars pray regularly and have some kind of belief in a higher power. That's half of the nothings in particular, not all the nuns, again, because of the 3/5 of the nuns that are nothing in particular. This is not how it should be, he made note of, because of Max Weber's sociological theory that the more prosperous a society becomes, the less religious it becomes. He didn't say Weber, but it's Weber's secularization theory. And again, if we look at Western Europe is not very religious at all. Look at any country in Western Europe, you'll see that belonging, believing, behaving has all gone way down. Why not the United States? We'll talk about that a little bit next week. But what all these data seem to indicate is that we are on the heels of Western Europe in terms of being secular, becoming more secular. Harry, did you have a? It's important to note that some nuns attend worship occasionally, but do not affiliate. He called this generally the spiritual but not religious group. I think some of the spiritual but not religious folks are also spiritual in a way that is not religious at all. And that would include not attending church. Who wants to do that? One quarter of nuns, that's all nothing in particulars. I mean, 1/4 of the nothing in particulars will switch to Christianity or to another religion. That's why he sees this as a fluid group. And again, he talked about the 3 Bs. Secularism is on the rise because atheists are loud. I would pick a fight with him on this point, but we don't have time for fights. In the part that I jumped away from, he talks about how the term evangelical is now being used by non-evangelicals to describe their religious affiliation, which I had not heard of until this interview. Some Muslims are calling themselves evangelical. It's like, what? Anyway, he makes that point. Let me see if I can, let me just get through this real quick. So here's the question, how do we respond to all this? I think denial, blame, and how do we get them back? All right. 3 typical, I'm sorry, I gotta press on here. Denial, the data are just wrong, this is crazy. Sociologists need to find another hobby. There will always be churches and synagogues and mosques. How could they just go away? It's impossible. Adults will come back to church when they have children. You know what the problem with this is? People are marrying later, having fewer children and having them later, after a time when their religious behavior, belonging, beliefs have pretty much been set. I do not expect people to have children in their 30s and then say, we have a child now, so suddenly, we haven't been in church since I was 12, but suddenly I'm going to go back. Blame, there's a lot of blaming going on. The factor of social media was brought up earlier, that perhaps could go on this list. People say society is too liberal. If society were not as liberal, we wouldn't have all these people leaving the church. Bring back prayer in schools. I haven't heard that for a long time, but it's there. Some people say the church is too liberal. Some people would say the church is too conservative. Right? If we just stopped talking about God so much, or whatever, the Nicene Creed or whatever. Some people say Generation Z and the millennials are self-centered. I've heard this too. So there's no room for transcendence in someone who's only concerned about me. Some people say, I must be to blame because my kids don't come to church. I heard that. And a lot of people blame Sunday morning soccer. I hear this again and again and again. I would say Sunday morning soccer and football and basketball are more symptoms of our secularization rather than causes. How do we get them back? They need to join the church. Are we concerned about them when we say this, or are we concerned about our church? Get a young pastor, sing snappier songs, stop wearing robes. No, go back to robes. Surely they want to be on the personnel committee. Yes. Last slide. We just change that narrative and accept this trend for what it is. It's real, probably not going away. And do we lean in and learn more, not just about the sociological data, but the individuals? Ministering to them as they are, relating to them as they are, and as they wish to be ministered to and related to.
I just want to.
Yes, Brenna, please.
When I come to the church, you all have been so wonderful to me, and I really appreciate y'all putting me on board, and especially as a parent calling minister and a spiritual conforming, you all accept me for worse or for better. And you're like, come on in, Verna, and I really love you for that.
We're glad you're here.
He said how large his church was, and I heard 15 people. Is that what you heard?
15 to 20.
Yeah.
So he must not have a brick and mortar place.
Oh, they might. Yeah. The churches outlive the buildings outlive the people.
Well,
I've noticed. Yeah. I really got to call us to a conclusion.